Have you ever watched a man lose everything he loves, yet refuse to bow? They called him a fool for believing that freedom was worth the pain. They mocked his faith, trampled his dignity, and took his harvest in the name of the king. The English officers rode through his land as if it were theirs, laughing, drinking, burning what little he owned. His wife hid in silence. His children learned to fear the sound of boots, and still he would not kneel. He was a farmer, not a soldier, a man of soil, not of war, but inside him burned something no army could crush, the quiet fire of a patriot. Have you ever felt powerless? Stay with me until the end, because what you are about to hear may shake your soul. It began far from the cities and the grand speeches of revolution, in a forgotten valley where the wind whispered through the trees. And a humble man named Bill Carter, known only as Bill from the hills, prayed for peace beneath the shadow of the mountains. Yet fate was already walking his path, and soon the quiet hills would no longer be quiet. Welcome, my fellow patriots. From which city are you watching today? Check if you're already subscribed, give this video a like. And now, let's begin our story. The morning light touched the valley like a secret the world had forgotten. Bill Carter stood beside the fence, watching the mist crawl across the fields. The soil was thin, the crops weak, yet his heart held firm because this land was his. Bought with sweat, guarded by faith, and paid for with dreams. Abigail came from the house with a cup of coffee, her hands trembling slightly. "You should rest," she whispered. Bill only nodded, behind. His calm eyes lived a storm no one could see. Inside the barn, a sound broke the stillness, the rattling of a chain. In the corner, half hidden beneath old hay, lay a wooden chest wrapped in iron and silence. Arthur once tried to lift it. Sarah had traced her fingers along its scars. Abigail had asked what was inside. Bill's answer never changed. What's in there belongs to another life. She stopped asking, but she never stopped wondering. That chest was more than wood and metal. It was a prison for the man he used to be, the soldier who had seen liberty die in smoke and betrayal, the man who once swore never to raise a weapon again. But the past has a way of waiting for the right wind to rise. Rumors had begun to reach the hills: British patrols burning farms, merchants raising taxes to starve the poor. Neighbors were dragged from their homes for speaking of rebellion. The Crown called it justice. Bill called it disgrace. Still, he kept silent. Until the day the soldiers came. They arrived at dawn, their red coats shining like blood against the pale fog. Their officer, a young noble with polished boots and a cruel grin, demanded grain for the king's men. Bill offered half. They took it all. When Abigail pleaded, they laughed. When Arthur tried to stop them, one struck him to the ground. The sound of that blow echoed through Bill's chest like thunder. Humiliation filled the air. The officer tossed a coin at Bill's feet, a payment for his dignity. "For your trouble, farmer," he sneered. The coin landed in the mud, and something inside Bill broke, not with anger, but with revelation. The peace he prayed for was a chain, one forged by obedience, tightened by fear. That night, the family sat in silence. Sarah wept into Molly's fur. Abigail's eyes glistened with rage and sorrow. Bill rose without a word and walked to the barn. He stared at the chest for a long time, listening to the whisper of his own heartbeat. Then he reached for the key hidden in the beam. Above the door, the metal was cold against his skin. When the lock snapped open, the air seemed to change. Inside, wrapped in old cloth, lay a musket, a faded flag, and a letter sealed with wax, the mark of a forgotten regiment. His hands trembled as he lifted the weapon. The weight felt both foreign and familiar. The scent of oil and dust carried memories he had tried to bury. Friends lost, promises broken, freedom betrayed. Abigail appeared at the door, her face pale but resolute. "If you open that chest," she said softly, "there's no going back." Bill turned to her, eyes filled with quiet fire. "There's no going back anyway." Outside, the hills stood silent, waiting. Somewhere in the distance, the faint echo of drums carried through the wind, British patrols marching closer. Bill placed the musket across his lap and whispered a prayer, not for peace this time, but for strength. The night deepened, heavy with decisions yet to be made. The family gathered by the dying fire, unaware that their lives were crossing the line between endurance and defiance. The chest stood open in the barn, its secret no longer hidden, its truth demanding a price. And in the shadow of the Appalachian hills, the flame of rebellion began to flicker once more, a spark that would soon set the valley ablaze. The road trembled before the echo of hooves. Dust rose like smoke, swallowing the morning sun. Bill Carter stood by his gate, jaw set, eyes fixed on the horizon. He already knew what was coming. The scent of arrogance carried on the wind. The redcoats arrived in a cloud of pride and contempt, their uniforms gleaming as if war were a parade. At their head rode Lieutenant Henry Fordham, young, polished, and cruel. Beside him, on a chestnut horse draped in fine leather, sat Thomas Brienne, the merchant who called himself a friend of the crown, but was known among the farmers as a vulture in human skin. They stopped before Bill's gate without greeting. Fordham's smirk was as sharp as his sword. "By order of His Majesty, tribute is due," he declared. "Every loyal subject will offer grain, livestock, or silver to the king's cause. Those who refuse will be reminded of their duty." His tone carried no threat. It was colder than that, the kind of indifference that believes itself untouchable. Thomas Breen lifted his chin and scanned the land with disdain. "Carter," he said, "you owe me for last season's seed. You'll pay now in coin or cattle." His smile was slick, almost mocking. Bill met his gaze without bowing. "You already took what was mine," he replied quietly. "There's nothing left to give." Fordham dismounted, his boots sinking into the dust. "Then we'll take what we please." His soldiers moved without hesitation, storming the barn, overturning barrels, tearing down the little that still stood. The sound of shattering wood cut through the air like thunder. Arthur ran forward, fists clenched, but Bill's arm stopped him. "No," he whispered, "not yet." Sarah watched from the doorway, her face pale, her hands trembling as she held Molly by the collar. Abigail stood beside her, eyes burning with silent fury. When one of the redcoats kicked the family's table aside, spilling the bread they had saved, the insult pierced deeper than any wound. It wasn't just theft, it was degradation. A message: "You are nothing." Fordham walked toward Bill, his shadow stretching long and cruel. "You people," he said with a faint laugh, "speak of liberty as if it were yours to own. You till the dirt, you pray to your ghosts, and yet you think yourselves equal to England." His words dripped with contempt. Bill's silence was heavy. Inside him, something old began to stir, the soldier buried beneath years of restraint. He felt the pulse of every injustice, every cry silenced by fear. And for the first time in years, he no longer felt afraid. He felt ready. Then Thomas Breen made the mistake of looking toward Sarah. "Pretty child," he said with a twisted grin. "Perhaps she'll fetch him." "Better price than your crops," Abigail gasped. Arthur lunged, shouting. The soldiers caught him, pinned him to the dirt, and laughed as he struggled. Fordham's hand went to his pistol, but before it left the holster, Bill's voice cut through the chaos. "Enough." The word froze the air. Even the horses seemed to stop breathing. Bill stepped forward, his eyes cold, his hands steady. "You've taken my land, my harvest, my dignity, but you will not take my family." Fordham tilted his head, amused. "And what will you do, farmer? Pray us away?" Bill's stare did not waver. "No," he said softly. "I've already prayed. Now I act." For a moment, no one moved. Then Fordham laughed, turned his back, and motioned for the men to continue. But in that instant, Bill saw something clearer than ever before. Peace was no longer survive. It was surrender. Liberty demanded sacrifice. And his journey toward rebellion had already begun. As the redcoats left, carrying sacks of grain and laughter like trophies, the valley fell silent again. Only the wind spoke, carrying the smell of dust and shame. Abigail stood beside her husband, eyes wet but fierce. "They'll come again," she whispered. Bill nodded slowly. "Let them. Next time, they'll find more than a farmer." Far away, thunder rolled beyond the mountains, not from the sky, but from the gathering of hearts no longer willing to kneel. A hidden truth was awakening in the hills, and soon its fire would consume everything built on oppression. "Right. The flame of freedom lives in me." Bill's voice was calm, but there was weight behind it, like thunder before the storm. "We've given all we have," he said, his tone steady though his hands trembled at his sides. "There's no justice in taking bread from the mouths of children." The words hung in the air, raw and human. For a brief second, silence stretched between the oppressor and the oppressed. Then Lieutenant Fordham's laughter shattered it, sharp, cold, mocking. "Justice?" he echoed. "Justice is the king's will." The soldiers chuckled behind him, their laughter echoing off the hills like a cruel refrain. The merchant Thomas Breen shook his head with a sneer. "You hill men," he said, his voice thick with disdain, "always whining about fairness, always pretending you matter." He looked around the humble farm, at the patched roof, the worn tools, the tired faces. "You should be grateful the king allows you to live on his soil at all." Something in Bill's eyes shifted. It wasn't Reich, it was something deeper, older, the quiet fire of a man who has seen dignity trampled too many times. "This soil," he said slowly, "belongs to no king. It was bought with my sweat, not his." The officer stepped closer, boots grinding into the dirt. "Careful, farmer," he whispered. "That kind of talk sounds like rebellion." Bill didn't move. "If refusing to starve is rebellion," he said, "then I suppose it has begun." The slap came fast. Fordham's glove struck his cheek with the weight of authority. The soldiers laughed again, the sound hollow and cruel. Bill didn't flinch. He only looked at the man in silence, his jaw tight, his pride unbroken. Fordham's amusement faded. Mockery turned to irritation. "You think you have dignity?" he hissed. "You have nothing." Abigail stepped forward, her voice trembling but clear. "We have each other," she said, "and that's more than you'll ever understand." The merchant scoffed, looking at her with disgust. "Careful, woman. Insolence has its price." His gaze drifted toward Sarah, and a cold smirk curved his lips. "Maybe your daughter can teach you humility." Before Fordham could react, Bill moved. He seized the officer's wrist and twisted, the pistol clattering into the dirt. In an instant, a musket butt struck his ribs. Another blow followed. The soldiers beat him down, their faces blank, trained to obey without thought. Abigail screamed, trying to reach him, but was held back. Arthur fought, but a rifle stock met his temple, sending him to the ground. Sarah cried out, clutching her mother's dress as chaos filled the yard. Blood ran from Bill's mouth, but his eyes still burned. Fordham leaned close, breath hot with contempt. "You'll regret this," he whispered. "We'll take everything you have, and when you crawl back begging for mercy, I'll remind you of this moment." Bill spat blood onto his polished boot. "You'll never see me crawl." The officer stood, humiliated by defiance. He raised his hand, ready to order destruction, but Brienne interrupted, his voice oily with false calm. "Let them live, Lieutenant. Let the others see what happens to those who defy the crown." Fordham hesitated, then nodded. The soldiers mounted their horses, leaving the yard in ruins. As they rode off, Brienne tossed a single coin into the mud. "For your pride," he said, laughing. When the sound of hooves faded, silence returned to the valley, heavy, suffocating. Abigail fell beside Bill, tears streaking her face as she pressed a cloth to his wound. "You shouldn't have," she whispered. Bill looked at her through the haze of pain. "If a man won't stand for his family," he said softly, "what's left of him?" Night fell over the hills, cold and endless. Bill sat by the dying fire, one hand resting on the musket from the chest. The weapon seemed to breathe with him, as if waiting. The stars above flickered like distant embers, reminders of a liberty still out of reach. He could still hear Fordham's laughter, still taste the dirt of his own land in his mouth. The humiliation was complete, but in that disgrace, something sacred was reborn. The man who once prayed for peace was gone. What remained was older, harder, a patriot carved by suffering, ready for the storm that would follow. The slap echoed like a gunshot through the valley. Bill's head turned with the blow, but his eyes never lowered. Blood slid down his lip, warm and metallic, a reminder of his silence and his endurance. Two soldiers dragged Arthur into the dirt, laughing as the boy struggled. "Stay down, rat," one hissed, driving a boot into his ribs. Molly lunged, barking with fury, but a redcoat kicked her aside, her body collapsing into the mud with a sharp yelp. Abigail's scream tore through the morning air. She ran forward, but a musket butt stopped her. Sarah clung to her mother's skirt, trembling. The child's face was pale, her tears carving lines through the dust. Fordham watched it all with cold amusement, his smirk painted with power. "Remember this, farmer," he said, his voice smooth as poison. "Peace belongs to those who bow." Bill said nothing. He looked at his son, at the blood on his shirt, at his wife's trembling hands. Then he turned his gaze toward Fordham, calm, deliberate, unbroken. The officer didn't like what he saw, defiance without words, a quiet strength that mocked his authority. "You'll learn respect," Fordham muttered. "Every man does, in time." Thomas Breen shifted on his horse, pretending pity. "Don't push him too far, Lieutenant," he said, though his smile betrayed pleasure. "We wouldn't want the man to think himself a martyr." Fordham laughed. "A martyr? He's a farmer. Dirt doesn't bleed, it breaks." He turned to leave, but Bill's voice cut through the air, low, steady, and burning. "One day," he said, "you'll find that dirt can rise." Fordham stopped, looked back, and for a heartbeat the world seemed to hold its breath. Then he gave a single nod to his men. "Burn it." The soldiers hesitated, only a moment before obeying. Torches touched the barn walls. Flames spread fast, devouring wood and memory alike. Smoke twisted into the sky, thick and black. The horse neighed. The chickens screamed. Sarah buried her face in her mother's dress as the family watched their world dissolve into fire. Arthur tried to rise again, fury in his young eyes, but Bill's hand stopped him. "No," he whispered. "Not now." His voice trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of patience. For a vengeance, not yet. Ready for a rebellion still in the shadows. Fordham mounted his horse, satisfied. "Let this be a lesson," he said. "The king's mercy is not endless." With a signal they turned, the sound of hooves fading into the valley's sorrow. Brienne lingered a moment longer, tossing a mocking glance toward Abigail. "Perhaps next time," he said softly, "you'll be wiser." Then he was gone. When silence returned, only the crackle of burning timber filled the air. Bill knelt in the ashes, the heat brushing his face, the smoke clawing at his lungs. His hands were black with soot, his eyes hollow but alive. Arthur crawled to Molly, lifting her gently. The dog whined but wagged her tail weakly, loyal even in pain. Abigail pressed her face against Bill's shoulder, whispering prayers that broke before they reached heaven. The barn collapsed, sparks raining like judgment. Bill rose slowly, staring at the ruins of everything he had built. "They think peace is obedience," he murmured. "They've forgotten what peace costs." His gaze hardened. No longer that of a farmer, but of something awakening. A man reshaped by disgrace, reborn in silence. That night the family huddled beneath the open sky, their home still smoldering behind them. Sarah slept between her parents, her small hand resting over Bill's heart. He stared into the darkness, seeing not the stars, but the ghosts of men he once fought beside, the faces of comrades who had died for liberty long before the word had meaning. He realized then that the same battle had returned, dressed in different colors, speaking the same language of oppression. There, among the ashes, the journey began again. A man broken of peace, bound by duty, and driven by a truth too long buried, that independence is never given, it is taken, paid for with courage and sacrifice. The hills would soon remember his name, not as a farmer, but as something far older. The yard lay in ruin. Smoke drifted low over the scorched ground, clinging to the air like a curse. Molly whimpered softly beside the ashes of the barn, her flank bruised, her breath shallow. Bill knelt, his hands trembling as he lifted Arthur from the dirt. The boy's face was streaked with blood and mud, his pride wounded deeper than his body. Bill brushed the blood from his cheek, his palm unsteady. "No man wins by rage," he whispered. But his eyes betrayed his words. They were no longer the eyes of a farmer seeking peace, but of a man stripped of illusion. The redcoats had gone, but their shadow lingered. Abigail pressed her shawl against Arthur's bruises, her hands shaking. Sarah sat silent beside her, clutching Molly's paw as if holding the last piece of innocence left in the world. The once green valley seemed gray now, drained of its spirit. Smoke rose where hope had lived. Bill stood, the pain in his ribs a dull fire. He looked toward the path where the English patrol had vanished, their laughter still echoing faintly through the hills. "Peace belongs to those who bow," Fordham had said. The words gnawed at him, each one burning deeper. He had bowed for years before taxes, before threats, before mockery. Yet peace had never come. Only more chains, only more shame. He walked to what remained of the barn. Charred beams jutted from the ground like bones. Beneath one blackened plank, the corner of something metal caught his eye. He knelt, brushed away the ash, and saw the chest, the same one he had opened days before. It had survived. The iron bands glowed faintly from the heat, but the lock still held firm. Inside rested his old musket, wrapped in the flag of his forgotten regiment. A remnant of the man he once was, now calling him again. Abigail approached quietly. "You said that part of your life was gone," she murmured. "It was," he replied, "until they brought it back." He opened the chest, the smell of oil and gunpowder escaping like the breath of a ghost. The musket gleamed faintly, scarred by time but alive with purpose. Arthur watched from behind, his young face a mix of fear and admiration. "Will you fight them?" he asked. Bill didn't answer. He only stared at the weapon, the reflection of the flames dancing along its barrel. That night, the family sat around the remains of their hearth. No roof, no walls, only the stars above them, cold witnesses to human cruelty. Bill's silence filled the air heavier than any sermon. He had always believed in endurance, in patience before defiance. But endurance without dignity was not virtue. It was slow death. The hills whispered with the voices of other men who had suffered the same disgrace, neighbors whose wives had been mocked, whose farms had been plundered, whose children had gone hungry under British rule. He had heard their stories in hushed tones, always followed by the same fearful pause, "We can do nothing." But now he knew that silence was the weapon of the tyrant. Every insult accepted, every injustice endured, forged the next chain. He looked at his son, then at the musket resting beside him. "There's a time when a man must choose," he said softly, "between peace and pride, between obedience and honor." Abigail met his gaze, tears glistening in the firelight. "And what if the cost is everything?" she asked. He placed his rough hand over hers. "Then let it cost." Liberty was never free. The wind rose from the mountains, carrying with it the faint sound of a horn, distant, almost imagined. Perhaps a malicious signal, or perhaps the memory of one. Bill listened, his expression unreadable. The journey he had avoided for years now stood before him, clear as dawn. He had prayed for peace his whole life. Now he understood that true peace would only come after the struggle, after rebellion, after sacrifice. The hills were quiet again, but the silence no longer meant defeat. It was the silence before a storm, the kind that changes nations. The tavern was thick with smoke and scorn. The smell of ale and sweat clung to the air like the memory of defeat. Bill sat at a corner table, his hat pulled low, hands wrapped around a chipped mug. The talk that night was not of crops or weather, but of soldiers, taxes, and fear. Men spoke louder than usual because anger made them feel less small. Elias Boone, a veteran of the frontier wars, slammed his mug on the table. "You talk of peace while they rob your land, Carter," he barked, his voice rough from years of gunpowder and whiskey. "You watched them burn your barn and you did nothing. Tell me, is that what liberty looks like where you come from?" The room stirred with low laughter. A few men nodded, others looked away. Bill lifted his eyes slowly. "Violence makes us like them," he said, his tone quiet but firm. "They want us to lose our souls before we fight. That's how empires win." Boone spat on the floor, spoken like a preacher, not a man. "The king's dogs only understand one sermon, lead and fire." The crowd laughed again, their mockery heavy, their courage fueled by ale and despair. "Someone," muttered the tame patriot. The phrase caught and spread, a cruel echo through the room. Bill didn't answer. He stared into his drink as if it held the truth he'd lost somewhere in the ashes of his home, but inside the words cut deep. The tame patriot. He could feel them burning under his skin like coals buried too long in silence. Elias leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "You think the crown cares about your peace? They'll take your land, your wife, your children, and when you finally raise that musket, they'll call you a rebel and hang you with your own rope. So tell me, farmer, when do you stop forgiving your tyrant?" Bill's jaw tightened. "When forgiveness becomes surrender," he said softly. Boone smirked. "Then you've already surrendered." The laughter returned, sharper now, tinged with contempt. But in the far corner, an old man, Isaac Halley, who had fought beside Bill years before, watched in silence. He saw something the others didn't, the stillness in Bill's posture, the restraint of a man not afraid to fight, but unwilling to waste his fury on fools. When the noise subsided, Isaac spoke, his voice calm and certain. "He won't stay tame forever." The tavern quieted. Even Boone looked uneasy. Bill's eyes lifted, meeting Isaac's across the room. A wordless understanding passed between them. One born of battle survived. of graves dug by their own hands. There was a time for talk and a time for reckoning. Bill nodded once, then stood. The scrape of his chair against the floor sounded like the beginning of something irreversible. Outside, the night was cold, the wind thick with the scent of rain and smoke. Bill walked the muddy road alone, the echo of laughter fading behind him. Each step felt heavier than the last. He thought of Abigail's weary hands, Arthur's bruised face, Sarah's tears by the fire. He thought of the flag folded inside the chest, the musket waiting in silence. The road passed by the churchyard, where the graves of fallen militiamen lay in crooked rows. He stopped there, removing his hat. The moonlight revealed the names carved into the stone men who had died, believing the struggle for dignity was worth the sacrifice. "You were right," he whispered to them. "Peace is not given. It's earned." The clouds gathered above the valley, dark and restless. In that silence, Bill Carter made his decision. The man who had once prayed for calm was gone. What rose in his place was something older than fear and stronger than grief, a soul no longer bound by humiliation but awakened by purpose. The journey that had begun in disgrace was now moving toward revelation. The rebellion was not in the cities or the courts, it was here, in the hearts of men who had nothing left to lose but their chains. The nights grew longer after the burning. The hills, once gentle and silent, now seemed to hold their breath, as if the earth itself feared what was stirring in Bill Carter's soul. The wind carried the scent of ash from the ruins of their barn, a constant reminder that dignity could be stripped, but never erased. Abigail watched him change. He no longer spoke of crops or weather. His hands, once steady with the plow, now trembled as they touched the musket hidden within the chest. Each night he sat beside it, the flicker of the hearthlight carving hard shadows across his face. His eyes had turned to iron, quiet, unyielding, and distant. "Are you all right?" she asked softly one evening. He didn't turn to her. "I'm praying for strength," he said, his voice hollow, "not peace." The words frightened her more than any threat from the soldiers. Peace had always been his anchor, his guiding star. But now she saw that star fading. The man she had married, the man who once believed goodness could soften cruelty, was vanishing into silence. Sarah and Arthur watched from the doorway, holding each other in the half-light. They didn't understand the depth of his thoughts, but they could feel it. The air inside the house was heavy, filled with something invisible and dangerous. The fire crackled softly, but it gave no warmth. The home that had once been their refuge now felt like a waiting place between what was and what was coming. Bill spent his days walking the land, running his fingers through the blackened soil as if speaking to it. He would pause at the fence line, gaze toward the distant ridge, and murmur words too quiet for anyone to hear. At times Abigail saw him tracing the old marks on his musket, reading names. Carved long ago, names of men who had died for liberty, their courage buried but not forgotten. At supper, he hardly ate. When Abigail asked if he'd seen anyone in the village, he only shook his head. "They mocked what they don't understand," he said quietly. "But they'll learn. Every man learns when he's hungry enough." That night, thunder rolled across the valley. Bill sat awake while the others slept, his mind replaying the insult of Fordham's voice, the laughter of the soldiers, the sight of Arthur's body in the mud. He clenched his fists until his knuckles whitened. The prayer that rose from his lips was no longer one of forgiveness. It was a plea for revelation, for a sign that righteousness could rise from ruin. In his heart he began to understand that liberty was not won through mercy, but through endurance. Each act of humiliation, each insult endured, was not defeat, it was the forging of resolve. The shame they had suffered had become a kind of armor, and the fear that once paralyzed him was turning into something fierce and sacred. At dawn, Abigail found him standing by the chest again, the key in his hand. The first light touched his face, and for an instant she saw both the man he had been and the one he was becoming. "Bill," she whispered, "if you open that again, there's no turning back." He looked at her, his expression steady. "There's no turning back anyway." Arthur stirred from his bed and watched his father in silence. He didn't know what it meant to fight for liberty, but he understood this. His father was preparing for something that would change them all. The storm outside began to break. Rain fell softly on the roof, whispering against the burned wood of the barn. It sounded like mourning, like confession, like destiny. Bill closed the chest once more without locking it. The decision was made. In the flickering gray of dawn, the Carter home stood quiet, fragile, and full of secrets. The hills waited beyond, cloaked in mist, as if hiding the truth of what was coming. The journey toward rebellion had already begun. It simply needed a spark. The storm rolled in from the mountains like an army without mercy. The sky bruised dark, split by flashes of white fire. Rain fell heavy, drumming against the ruined roof, tracing the scars left by the redcoats' boots. Bill stood outside, motionless, as the storm swallowed the valley. His coat clung to his shoulders, soaked through, but he did not move. His gaze was fixed on the distant ridge, where the road cut through the trees. Through the curtain of rain, he saw them red coats glinting, horses moving in formation, the same patrol that had humiliated his family. Lieutenant Fordham at the front, arrogant even in the storm, his sword flashing like lightning each time the sky tore open. They were heading toward another homestead farther down the valley, the McAllisters, a family with children no older than Sarah, their crops barely surviving the taxes. Bill's breath turned to frost in the cold air. He watched in silence as the patrol passed through the rain, and his fists began to tighten at his sides. The sound of hooves faded into the wind, but something inside him refused to quiet. The humiliation, the degradation, the burning of his barn, all of it had lived buried in his chest like a poisoned root. Now, it began to grow. Abigail stepped into the doorway, her shawl clutched against the rain. "Bill," she called, but he didn't answer. He stood like a statue carved from the earth, water streaming down his face, though it wasn't clear if it was rain or tears. "They'll keep coming," he said at last, his voice low and hollow. "Every week another family broken, another fire." He looked toward the heavens, the storm raging above him. "One day, Lord, one day." The words came out as a prayer, but they felt like a vow, a promise born from suffering, forged by shame. For the first time, the storm didn't frighten him. It spoke to him. Every thunderclap sounded like a heartbeat, every flash of lightning like a revelation. The Lord had not answered his prayers for peace, perhaps because he was waiting for him to act. He walked back into the house, his boots leaving dark prints across the floorboards. Abigail met his eyes, searching for the man she once knew. She found him, but changed. There was still love in him, still the same steady soul she had married. But now it burned with something more dangerous than rage: purpose. Sarah peeked from behind the table, clutching a small wooden doll. Arthur stood beside her, jaw clenched, watching his father with quiet awe. The house felt smaller than before, as if the air itself could sense what was coming. Bill sat by the hearth, his hands resting on his knees, staring into the fire until his reflection disappeared in the glow. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, carrying the distant echo of screams, the sound of another home raided, another life torn apart. Bill closed his eyes, each cry searing into his mind like scripture. The struggle for dignity had ceased to be a thought. It had become a summons. When the thunder softened, he rose and walked to the window. The rain had eased, but the mist clung to the hills like breath. The musket stood by the door, its barrel clean, ready. He placed a hand on it, not in violence, but in understanding. It was no longer a weapon, it was a truth he had tried to deny. The storm began to fade, leaving the world washed and raw. In the distance, a single torch flickered, a farmhouse burning. The glow bled through the fog, painting the valley in shades of grief and defiance. Bill watched it for a long time, his face unreadable. Then, almost to himself, he whispered, "If peace is bought with chains, I'll buy liberty with fire." The wind carried his words into the hills, where they lingered like a prophecy. The man who once sought stillness had been reborn in the tempest. The birth of silence had passed. Now came the stirring of rebellion. The seed was awake, and the soil of the valley would never rest again. The morning came gray and still, the storm having bled the world of color. The land looked older, tired, as though it had carried the weight of every broken promise. Bill Carter stood by the broken gate, hammer in hand, mending it plank by plank. The sound of nails striking wood echoed through the valley like a heartbeat, slow, deliberate, unyielding. Each strike carried the memory of the slap, the laughter, the humiliation that had burned. His soul raw. His face was calm, but the calmness no longer belonged to peace. It was the stillness before fire. Abigail watched from the doorway, arms crossed against the cold. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The man outside was both her husband and a stranger now. The gentle farmer who once prayed for forgiveness had been replaced by someone forged in silence. Bill's shoulders moved with purpose, his eyes fixed on the work before him, but his mind was elsewhere, far away, tracing paths of vengeance through the fog. When he finished, he stood still, staring at the fence line. The world was quiet again, too quiet. The birds didn't sing. Even the wind seemed to hesitate before crossing the hills. Bill wiped the sweat and sawdust from his brow and turned back toward the barn. The ashes of its old walls still marked the ground, faint scars of fire. Inside, the smell of smoke lingered, mixed with the scent of earth and iron. Dust hung in the air, unmoving. The chest sat in the corner, half buried in shadow. Its chains were rusted, its edges blackened by the flames that hadn't quite claimed it. Bill approached slowly, his boots stirring the dust, his breath shallow. He ran his hand along the lid, feeling the grooves, the weight of what it held. It wasn't just a box, it was his past, his shame, his unspoken oath. For a long while he said nothing. His reflection stared back at him in the dull metal of the locked, scarred, but steady. He remembered the faces of the men at the tavern, the sneers, the mockery, the tame patriot. The words had stung then. Now they felt like an old skin he had shed. The man who once sought mercy had died in the dirt with his pride. What remained was something reborn in the ashes of humiliation. Behind him, the door creaked. Arthur stood there, still bruised from the beating, his face thin and pale. "Pa," he said softly, "are they coming back?" Bill turned, his expression unreadable. "They'll come," he answered. "They always do." He looked back at the chest. "But next time, I'll be ready." Arthur nodded, understanding more than his father thought he could. He walked closer, placing a small hand on Bill's arm. "Will we fight them?" Bill didn't answer. He looked toward the open door, toward the hills bathed in mist. "We'll do what men must do when the world leaves them no choice." Abigail watched from the doorway of the house, her heart caught between fear and pride. She knew the meaning of those words. There was no turning back now, not for any of them. The path toward rebellion had been chosen the day the redcoats burned their home, though no one had spoken it aloud. The silence between them said everything. As the sun broke weakly through the clouds, its light fell across the chest, glinting on the chain. The air felt different, heavier, older, as if history itself was waiting for a decision. The camera of memory would linger there, on that silent box, untouched but alive. The musket within it would one day speak, louder than words. And when it did, the world would remember this day. The day a humble farmer stopped believing peace could save them, and the flame of rebellion began to breathe. The hills never truly slept again after that day. The silence that once wrapped them in peace now trembled with the echo of coming storms. Each dawn, the valley awoke beneath a sky heavy with remembrance, and in that stillness, the spirit of defiance grew. Word spread quietly from farm to farm about the redcoats, about the fire, about the man who had stood and said no more. His name passed through the whispers of the people like a promise. Bill from the hills. He became a symbol before he became a soldier. The neighbors began to visit at dusk, one by one, men with calloused hands, women who had lost their sons, boys who had seen their fathers humiliated. They came not with speeches or banners, but with eyes that carried the same wound. In that shared silence, rebellion found its shape. It was no longer the cry of a single man. It was the awakening of a nation. Bill stood before them, weathered by loss but alive with purpose. "They've taken our land," he said, his voice steady, "but they will not take our will. They can burn our homes, but not our dignity. They can chain our bodies, but not our souls." The crowd listened, not cheering, not shouting, but breathing together, as if the same heart beat within them all. That night the old musket was lifted from the chest. The metal gleamed faintly beneath. The light of the hearth. Abigail stood behind him, her eyes filled with both sorrow and pride. "You'll change things," she whispered. Bill looked toward the door where the darkness waited like destiny. "No," he said quietly, "we will." The first shot fired in that valley would not be remembered for its sound, but for its meaning. It was not just a bullet, it was an answer to arrogance, to oppression, to the endless weight of submission. It was the sound of ordinary men reclaiming what kings had forgotten, that liberty belongs to those who fight for it, not to those who command it. The hills echoed that shot, and the flame of resistance spread from ridge to ridge, from village to village, until it reached the hearts of thousands. Each soul that rose carried within it the same truth, that dignity is worth any sacrifice, and that the cost of silence is far greater than the cost of struggle. Years later, when people spoke of those who had stood against the empire, they spoke of the great names, the generals, the statesmen, the heroes cast in bronze. But in the quiet corners of the land, they also spoke of him, the farmer who once bowed his head in prayer and rose with fire in his heart. Because liberty does not begin in palaces. It begins in the dirt, in the smoke, in the tears of those who refuse to kneel. And in every age, there will always be another man, another woman, another soul who hears that same call. If you've walked this journey with me, if you've felt the weight of their sacrifice and the pulse of their courage, then you already carry that same flame. The flame of freedom burns in me. Here, every story is a tribute to those who stood tall when the world demanded they bow. If you believe their spirit still lives, let this be our bond. Leave your mark, share your strength, and keep the fire alive. Here is another story of courage and sacrifice. Click and continue with me.